So, Dr. Messner, where and when were you born?
I was born in Salinas, California in 1952 to parents who had also just moved there a couple of years earlier. My father had been in the Navy during World War II, and he had been a student and a football player at UC Berkeley before that. And my mother was from Chicago, Illinois, and the two of them met during the war and got married. And then he got a teaching job at Salinas High School, and he was a high school PE coach and a basketball and football coach. And so they moved to Salinas and raised their family there. I had two older sisters, and then I was the last of the family to be born.
What month were you born? I'm interested in people's astrological sign. Is it
July 1st, so start of the
Cancer.
New fiscal year.
Ah. Well, I think of Cancer people as being sensitive. They can be a little moody, intuitive. Does any of that apply to you?
I don't know. I guess I never put too much stock in the astrological signs myself, but I don't think I'm particularly moody, for sure. I'm fairly level, maybe to a fault.
I know my friends always say, well, how's everything? Fine. Gail, you have no drama in your life. I know what that's like. So when you wrote King of the Wild Suburbs, a memoir, Fathers, Sons, and Guns, was that partly referring to you personally?
Well, sure, that was a memoir, and it was really about me and my father and my grandfather, about my relationship with those two men. And my grandfather had been a working class guy who had fought in World War I and then moved from Michigan out to Berkeley and Oakland after World War I with my grandmother and much of her family. They were all from northern Michigan, and he was a hunter. And he raised my father as a hunter. My father then, of course, went to college, but kind of retained that as a way of bonding with his own father, and then kind of they initiated me into hunting when I was a little kid. And so the King of the Wild Suburb, of course, the title refers to the Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. But I was, initiated into that kind of hunting culture with men, and it became a really important way for me to connect with my father and my grandfather. And I also had sports with my father as well. That was very important because he was a high school coach. I ended up playing high school basketball for him as my coach. But it was a way for the memoir was a way for me to explore my relationship with those two men long after both of their deaths, and also a way for me to think about my sort of socialization into the mid-20th century version of masculinity that was, eventually I came to become critical of, but that also I think probably served me pretty well in terms of the kind of layers of privilege that I was raised with.
What parts of it were you critical about, and what parts did you retain as your identity as a man?
Well, the parts that I think I retained from my father, and probably got also some from my grandfather, were a sense of integrity that I've tried to retain, at least, and a sense of responsibility for other people around me, responsibility for your family. My father was one of those high school coaches that was concerned first and foremost with what kind of boys and men he was helping to shape and what kind of citizens he was helping to shape. And then winning came second. And that's, unfortunately, that has gotten flipped with a lot of organized sports in recent decades. But so I think that sort of value system is something that I really have learned a lot from and tried to hold on to in a lot of ways. And I guess one of the things that I really learned from my father in retrospect, though, was the ways in which he was a very successful man in a local kind of way. I mean, he'd been a military veteran. He was a highly respected high school coach, and had played football in college and was a good football player, and had kind of all those markers of masculine success. He was a successful family breadwinner and very respected in the community. And when he died, it was a headline in the local Salinas newspaper: "Mr. Basketball dies." And so I was drawn to all of that kind of masculine status and public adulation that comes with being a successful man. But on the other hand, my dad died in his mid-50s. I'm sorry. He was 56 years old when he died, and he had colon cancer. I often say that masculinity killed my father as much as cancer did, because he had been raised with this idea that you ignore pain, that you give up your body for the team, you give up your body for the country, you give up your body for your family. And he had some early symptoms. He had colon cancer. He just ignored the symptoms. He was always very proud that he didn't use any of his sick leave from his job as a teacher. He would go in just feeling terrible, his back hurting, he would never stay home. And so he had this ethic of giving up his own health for other people around him and ignoring his pain. Don't whine. He hit me with that a little bit when I was a little kid. Don't be a crybaby if you hurt yourself playing sports. Spit on it and go play, sort of thing. And so, I think, by the time my father finally did go to the doctor, his cancer was very advanced. And we know that colon cancer is one of those ones, if you catch it early, there's really high success rate in treating it and you live a long life. But I think these lessons that he learned from the Navy, from sports, from culture in general in the middle of the 20th century about men, led him to think that he should not be a whiner, a complainer, and look for help. And we know a lot from the research and the health research that's a general problem. A lot of men don't seek help in terms of health problems and don't take care of themselves. And I think that's really linked to that quest for success, that quest for masculine adulation and status in the community. So it became kind of the part of the theoretical orientation that I always held to as a sociologist, that feminist critique of men's power and privilege in the world, it's very real. I mean, men have institutional power and privilege. It's historically based, and then it gets baked right into us as little boys. You're supposed to be at the top of the pyramid, you're supposed to strive, and that there are these privileges out there if you just kind of work for them, and you will be adored by other people for it. And you'll get material benefit from it as well. But that's linked. The other side of that coin is the cost of masculinity to men, the cost that we pay for hammering ourselves into these really narrow definitions of masculinity that end up harming us. And you can see it in health data, like men's life expectancy shorter than women's.
I think it's 6 years.
Yeah, and heart problems, cancer, all kinds of suicide rates, the ways in which men suffer from sort of hidden depression that's undiagnosed. All of these things, I think, are the other side of the coin of men's power and privilege. So to me, those two things are inseparable. You have to think of them together. It's not like we're whining, or that I'm whining, oh, poor men, we have it so bad. Yes, but the other side of that is one of the reasons why men suffer in so many ways psychologically, limits to our relationships, our limits to our health, is because of this sort of promise of privilege that the culture teaches us to strive for, and the real benefits that come if you do strive for those privileges still.
Well, this is confusing to me because it seems so logical to me that there are benefits in male privilege, but there's also hazards, like Herb Goldberg pointed out a long time ago, and the hazards of being male. But I'm getting the sense from men who really identify as feminist or pro-feminist that they think if you acknowledge that men suffer in any way, then you're denying the real oppression of women. So it seems like it's almost a politically correct thing that you don't talk about ways that men hurt.
Well, most of the men that I know who define themselves as feminists or pro-feminists don't make that distinction. I mean, they do focus on the ways in which masculinity is limiting, or these sort of narrow definitions of masculinity are limiting for men and hurtful to men. But I think, there's and I've written about this, about men's movements over the past 30 or 40 years, and there's a historical kind of movement-based dynamic at work here, where I think you mentioned Herb Goldberg. I think back in the 1970s, some of the early men's liberationists, who were many of them psychologists, Joseph Pleck and Robert Brannon, and then Warren Farrell, who's not a psychologist, but I think was kind of part of that first wave of men's liberationists. And I think they had that in the early going. They had that sort of two sides of the coin, the costs of masculinity and men's privileges, and they were really absorbing the critique that was coming from feminist women about men's power and privilege. And I think what ended up happening is that there's a tension there. There's clearly a tension between identifying the fact that men have power and privilege because of the history and structures of patriarchy, and that men are hurt because of it too. And I think both of those things are true, but there's a real tension there that's operating. So what ended up happening, I think, was some of the tensions within organizations of men, like the National Organizations for Changing Men, National Organization for Men Against Sexism, NOMAS, that developed in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, that those organizations ended up kind of blowing apart, partly along that fissure. There was other things too. It had to do with race and sexuality that we can also talk about. But I think there was that fissure between the costs and privileges of masculinity. And some of the men in those organizations ended up emphasizing a lot more the costs of masculinity. Herb Goldberg and I think Warren Farrell kind of went that way as well. And those are the men who kind of flowed into and ended up shaping the men's rights organizations, and what, if you want to call it a movement, men's rights movement. And then other men who were more oriented towards radical feminism, John Stoltenberg and some others, I think, emphasized a lot more the power and privileges of masculinity, and maybe tended to downplay because they thought it was dangerous maybe to talk about. It's like, being a white person is saying, oh, racism hurts me too. It's like, yeah, but, not really. It's not like being in a subordinated racial category, right? Racism dehumanizes us, we white people. It surely does, but it's not like it hurts us in the ways that it does the people who are in the subordinate groups. And so a lot of feminist men were saying that as well. Okay, but, what we really need to focus on is the harm that men and masculinity do to others, the harm that, sexual assault, rape, sexual harassment of women in workplaces, all of these things that kind of benefit men in concrete ways. We should be, as men, focused on those things and not whining about our hurt feelings, So I think there was that group that went in that direction. So you end up having that schism, and it pulls apart. And I've always thought it would be really productive to continue to hold on to that connection, not go into the men's rights direction, which I think very easily devolves into an anti-feminist and sometimes very misogynist anti-woman discourse and action, and not the pro-feminist direction that ignores men's hurts and psychological and emotional needs, because that can very easily devolve into just sort of a self-flagellation that's not appealing to almost any boys and men. You have to bring in something that's going to be appealing to boys and men. Like, what are you going to gain from really taking seriously the feminist critique of patriarchy and men's power and privilege? Well, you gain a much broader humanity. You gain possibly better health. You gain possibly better relationships with your children, with women, with male friends or male lovers. There's so much to gain from broadening and deepening your humanity. So that still has been my orientation over time. And then the other piece to it, I think, that's very important, that really came out much more in the 80s and 90s, I think, and still is extremely important to think about, is when we talk about men and masculinity, it's always important to think about which men are we talking about, because we're not all the same. And when we talk about male privilege, for instance, and costs of masculinity, black men, poor, working class, men, Latino men, immigrant men, queer, gay men. I mean, those men from those groups don't necessarily have very direct access to male privilege.
Right.
And if you're thinking about the costs of masculinity, low life expectancy, and all those other things that we were talking about earlier, it's men in those social groups that are paying much more of those costs of masculinity. The early death, victimhood from violence. It's mostly not men from my social groups that are paying those costs of masculinity as much. We have more access to the privileges of masculinity. So when you start looking at class and race, it really complicates the picture a lot.
When I talked to Daniel Ellenberg, who is the president of the APA Division 51 Men's Studies, Men's Therapy, whatever you want to call it, division, he kind of leans in the direction that we do, but he said the men, I mean, this is a broad statement, but the men in the division, like, they don't want to talk to Warren Farrell about the importance of fathers, and they don't want to talk about him because it's this political purity, political correctness thing, I guess. And I've gotten some of that kind of response from pro-feminist men in terms of being in the book. They don't want to be contaminated by being with Warren Farrell and Fred Hayward and Jack Hammer. So I don't really understand that not wanting to dialogue. It's interesting. It's fun to have those kind of discussions. Yeah. I don't get it.
Well, those things run pretty deep, and and they've been going on for many decades, I think, those schisms between different groups. And I think that the APA, group that studies, psychologists who study and do clinical work with men, I don't think they are all of a piece either. I've spoken with their group a number of years ago, and there's quite a range within that group in terms of their perspectives on, for instance, fathers and men's rights and feminism and so forth. When I think about, and I don't really consider myself to be an expert in recent formations of men's rights movement. I think there's so many things that have been happening that are quite different, especially with younger men now, some of which are way scarier than things that I was criticizing in the 90s. Incels, men who were on these, online groups that are just misogynist and have this sense of entitlement to women's bodies and just get really angry if women aren't willing to have sex with them, and they want to take it out, and they do sometimes take it out on women. I mean, that's pretty scary stuff to me. But I think there's a range within what I think of as the big umbrella of a men's rights movement. There's a range of perspectives there. And there are, in fact, some men who I would say, and some tendencies under that umbrella that I think are probably not worth talking to, frankly. For me, I don't want to waste my time. But there are some who I think have genuine commitments to, for instance, men's health, genuine commitments to trying to figure out how men can have better and deeper relationships with their own children. Those are people who I think are really worth talking to and having dialogues with, that I think it's bridgeable. The gap between what I think of as more of a kind of feminist orientation and maybe a father's rights orientation. I think that there's a way to dialogue across that, and it's bridgeable, and there are ways to find common ground, and maybe there's also continuing disagreements. But I think what a lot of pro-feminist men feel, and I think I identify with this a lot myself, is that the primary commitment I have is to progressive social movements, feminism being primary among them, and to racial justice movements, and if there are organizations or individuals out there who are doing work and saying things that I think are undermining what I think of as social justice, I think the possibility of, or let me put it this way, the decision to put a lot of time in trying to dialogue with those people, to me, is not something I want to spend my time doing.
Right. That's like, I don't really want to talk to Trump lovers too
Yeah.
much. I mean, I'd be interested a little bit, but I don't think it would be very profitable. Yeah.
Right.
Then the other thing I don't understand in this kind of schism is, like, Warren Farrell and Fred Hayward emphasize the importance of fathers. And then when I interviewed Andrew Smiler, he said, well, that's not so clear from the studies. It's the harm to kids is a conglomeration of traumas. It's how many traumas the child experienced. It's not necessarily whether the father was in the picture or not. So do you agree that that seems to be an area of tension in people who are doing men's work? And if so, why? Because the studies show that kids do better with two parents.
Yeah, except for if it's a two-parent family where there's violence and conflict, and
Right.
I think the kids are better off with a loving single parent
Yeah.
than they are with two parents who are, putting the kids in danger and exposing them to trauma and violence.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think that's an issue that, I think we can't just simply say two parents are always better. Two parents or two adults in a family might also mean more money, and so less of the problems, connected with just a single income trying to support a family. So there's all kinds of ways in which, two adults can be an improvement, but it's not necessarily an improvement. And I think, I had a colleague years ago who wrote a book called The Good Divorce, and she, drew from data that showed that, when there's amicable divorce and parents of children have, maintain good communication and primary commitments to the kids, that it can be way better for the kids if the parents divorced than if they had stayed together and continued all of those sort of tensions that
Yeah.
they have.
I did a book called How to Survive Your Parents' Divorce, Kids' Advice to Kids, and that's what they said. If the parents were in conflict, they were relieved that they got a divorce. Thank God they got a divorce. And if the divorce kept them out of that being involved in the conflict, then they were glad.
Right. Yeah.
Which, you don't need to be a rocket science to figure that out, I think. Well, how do you label yourself as in terms of are you a feminist ally, what are you?
Well, that's kind of evolved a bit for a while. I mean, I think when I was kind of cutting my teeth on a lot of this sort of work back in the late 70s and the early 80s, I think there was a lot of, hand-wringing about what do we call ourselves, allies or pro-feminists, and there was some sense among a lot of men that, we couldn't call ourselves feminists because feminism was an identity that was attached to women's activism. So you'd have to have the experience of being a woman and being oppressed as a woman to call yourself a feminist. And so I was kind of, when I first got my job at USC, back in the late 80s, I was still kind of struggling with that. And I think I was calling myself a pro-feminist at the time. And I was hired in a gender studies program. It was then called the Program for Study of Women and Men in Society. It was SWIMS, we called it. And I was this one, straight white guy who was hired into this program that was made up mostly of women who were senior to me. They were mostly then women in their mid-50s, and they fought for feminism and fought for women's studies to get a foothold in universities and in academic disciplines. And one of my senior colleagues, you probably would remember her name, Carol Jacqueline. She was a co-author of the very famous Maccabee and Jacqueline psychology book. She's a wonderful person. And I was talking with her one time about this, and she just leaned over right across the table and she said, "Michael, I want you to call yourself a feminist." And I said, "Okay, Carol." And so from then on, I have called myself a feminist because she said it's really important for men to feel comfortable calling themselves feminists, and then be ready to explain it to people, what that means to you. But don't. If she felt like it was waffling, to call yourself a pro-feminist or a feminist ally, call yourself a feminist, and then tell people what that means to you. And so to me, that means, accepting the and sort of trying to absorb that feminist critique of men's power and privilege. That it's historically based, that it's still that there's still ways in which men are institutionally and interactionally benefiting just from being born as men. And at the same time, it also means that you are committed to acting to change that, to bring about equality in the world, and along lines of gender and other sort of intersecting lines. To me, that's what it means to be a feminist, and you don't have to have been born a woman or experience the world as a woman to take that on. And so, I think there still are some women feminists who don't agree with that, who think that only women can be feminists. But I think among most younger people, it's not an issue anymore. I mean, I find a lot more young men on college campuses now who are very comfortable calling themselves feminists, and most young women want them to as well. So I don't think it's quite the issue that it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah, when I started teaching, my women students would say, "I'm not a feminist, but I believe in equality."
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's really changed. Let's go back to your biography. Having two older sisters, that I'm sure that opened you to a glimpse of the world of young women and dating and their kind of dramas, because it seems like teen girls get involved with cliques and dramas, and these two are against these three, or this one feels left out. I wonder what you learned from having two older sisters.
Well, I really looked up to both of my sisters. One of them, Terry, was 5 years older than me, and Linda about 2.5 years older than me. And my father had been, in addition to being a high school coach, he also was in the Naval Reserve. So he would be gone, like one weekend out every month, and then during the summers he would go off for several weeks to Navy training kinds of tours, I guess they call them. And so I was with my mother and my sisters a lot when my father wasn't around, and I really looked up to his world of sports and the military and all of that. But I in fact spent a lot of time with just my mom and my sisters, and I think I identified with my father in a lot of ways and with his public world. But I think that sort of domestic world of my sisters and my mom became very important to me on a deep emotional level. And I saw, as I got a little bit older, probably not till after I was out of high school, and I started kind of taking some classes and thinking about this stuff a little bit more. But I realized that my sisters had been raised in this very kind of post-war, with this very post-war sort of mentality of like, you can go to college if you want, but most girls go to college to find a husband. And me being told, you're going to go to college because as a boy, as a man, you have to expect to be able to have to take care of a family and earn an income. So there was this, from the get-go, a very unequal message that my sisters and I were given. And I thought about that. I started to think about that a lot in retrospect as I started to think about gender a bit when I was in college and when I was at Chico State. And I started realizing that, my sisters, in some ways were really dealt an unfair deal. And I think both of them came to see it that way. I mean, we were a very sports-oriented family. I was the only one who had access to any kind of sports. There was nothing for girls. There was, and in high school, pre-Title IX, there was nothing. And one of my sisters, the older one, Terry, was a cheerleader, which was like, she was really, got a pretty high status for being a cheerleader in 1965. But my other sister, Linda, was fairly athletic, but she had no outlets to express that. And in retrospect, she resented that. She felt sad by it, and I felt sad for her about that. So, as a 35-year-old, she finally got involved in a community softball league and just loved it so much. But she was only able to play for a little while before she was in her 40s, So, I think a lot of what I learned from my sisters and my mother was, and I should say too, my mother, in retrospect, expressed to me, disappointment as well. She would say to me when she was in her 60s and 70s, wow, I wish I had the opportunity that a lot of the girls today have. I mean, when I was working during World War II, the whole kind of Rosie the Riveter era, she wasn't a riveter, but she worked in the USO and was dancing on tables, having a pretty good time. But still, she had jobs, and then she married my father, and the expectation for middle class women, white middle class women especially, was out of the labor force, into the home, baby boom time, and so then she was home alone a lot with me and my sisters, and she was unhappy about that, and she didn't express that to me as a kid, but later in life, she told me just how limiting that was and how she resented it. And so I think over the years I learned a lot from both my sisters and my mom about the limits that were placed on women, and then the sort of responsibilities that men might have to make a different kind of world.
That kind of woman was influenced by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, that she named the problem that had no name, and that was the start of the second wave of the women's movement. So your mother was part of a big group of people that led to the second women's movement.
That's right, and she never back then would have defined herself as a feminist, and probably wasn't expressing that in the same way Betty Friedan did in 1963. I'm talking more about the 90s when my mom finally kind of came around thinking this way in retrospect. I'm like, wow. And I don't know that my mom even read The Feminine Mystique back then, or was open to it even in the 1960s, but I think it's something that gradually sunk in with her over time, and she realized the ways in which she had been limited.
Right. Why did you decide to study sociology at Chico State and then Berkeley?
Well, I first went to a community college in my hometown, Hartnell College, still thinking I was going to be a great basketball player, but I ended up sitting on the bench and watching everyone else play.
Oh, dear.
And then I transferred to Chico State as a biology major. And I kind of just did that because I hadn't really been thinking much about it. I had taken biology in high school and thought it was okay. And so I thought I'll just be a biology teacher. And like my dad, I'll be a high school teacher. And when I got to Chico State, I had already taken at Hartnell intro anthropology, cultural anthropology, and intro sociology class. And I kind of found them interesting, and then when I started in at Chico State, I thought, well, maybe I'll minor in sociology. So I took a couple more sociology classes, and I kind of caught fire with it. And meanwhile, I was losing interest in biology, and the sort of harder science and mathematical sides of it, especially, were turning me off. And so I started taking more and more sociology classes, and by the time I was middle of my junior year, I changed my major to sociology, and I never really looked back.
And I never really.
A lot of that was. It was
early 1970s.
Early 1970s. I graduated high school in 70s. 72, 73, 74. I was undergrad at
Chico State.
Chico State,
and the anti-war movement was kind of
winding down, and I think I
ignited a little bit by the
tail end of that.
But then
what was ascendant was the women's movement.
A lot of the
young women on campus were in women's groups,
and they were challenging men. Don't call us girls, we're women. Change your language. And it was
just making us think. It was jarring, and a lot of the guys I knew back then were kind of taken aback by it and
reacting
in negative ways. And
I probably did a little bit too
defensive at first. But since I was taking sociology classes,
it kind of think about
personal experiences in a broader sort of way. And you probably remember this era, that I was taking classes like social stratification at Chico State, and there was nothing about gender. It was all about race and class. And I think at the very end of the class, the teacher gave us a little lesson on income inequality between men and women. And I was stunned by it. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing because isn't this the land of equality and equal opportunity? If everybody's doing the same job, shouldn't they get paid the same? And so it was one of the sparks that brought together this personal experience I was seeing from some of the young women I knew with the academic stuff that I'd been getting pulled to about race and class, suddenly the other gender also, and that became really interesting to me. And then I was staying on this track though, becoming a high school teacher. So when I finished my BA, I stayed on at Chico State and started a teaching credential program. And I was placed in high school Paradise, which unfortunately had such a horrible disaster in the last couple of years of fires. Beautiful area. And I was in this wonderful social science class. As a student teacher, and I don't remember the instructor's name. He was a young man, and he was the most amazing teacher. He had these kids doing all of these projects, really engaged. And then when it would become my turn to take over the class for the day, everything would just fall apart. Terrible. I felt like I had for years before that worked in summer jobs as a recreation supervisor, where I kind of whistle and just yell at kids all the time. I felt like it just reverted to that, just like becoming a cop and yelling at kids. So I thought, well, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should not become a junior high school teacher. And so I dropped out of that program, and I stayed at Chico and I enrolled in a master's program. And that's where I got much more intellectually engaged, and I had some really good classes, and met some really cool people. And when I finished my master's, and also during that time, it became much more identified as a Marxist. I got really engaged, and I did this kind of bridge to my work at the junior high school with master's work. I developed this simulation, classroom simulation about how to teach Marxist kids.
Oh, wow.
And it became my master's project when I published it in Insurgent Sociologist, which I think now called sociology, because I don't talk about insurgency anymore. But it was a Marxist simulation game. And then I got out of Chico. I got a job working at Sacramento City College, just as a one semester replacement in a really amazing experimental college that has been set up just a few years earlier. It was one of those kind of 60s things that was happening in the 70s, like really no grades, interdisciplinary, three instructors, biologist, social scientist, and an English professor, all teaching, sitting in a room with 100 people and trying to do creative things. So I did that for one semester, and then I stayed on at Sac City for three more semesters, just teaching part-time sociology classes, including out at a Air Force Base. And then I got laid off after Jarvis Scan, Proposition 13. A lot of people got laid off. My mom lost her job temporarily working for Monterey County. My sister Terry also lost her job for a few months working for Monterey County. I lost my job at Sacramento City College because I was part-time anyway, kind of like a first fast hired, easily fired. And so over the next year, that was the only year of my life that I've not been in school. either from kindergarten to this moment. It's like 1 year of my life I wasn't in school. my father died that year,
and I
went back and spent some time with my mom,
and
was applying to graduate school, and I ended up getting in at UC Berkeley, so I started there the following year. So that's kind of my academic or my educational trajectory. I finished there in 1985.
And what was your dissertation about?
It was
about
masculinity
and sports.
And I
worked with
Bob
Launer, who's earlier known
Robert
Launer, who was a very big expert in race relations.
He taught one of the first
courses on men and masculinity in the
maybe
country.
Maybe the first one in sociology.
I'm not sure.
And I came in
maybe the second or third year that he was teaching that course, and I TA for him for a couple of years.
Really cut my teeth.
That class, and I was
really committed to
doing something on men and masculinity. During that year I was off before I went back to grad school. I was living part of that time in Santa Cruz, and I got involved in a consciousness raising group. And I was really interested in men and feminism by that time. And
so I said to
Bob when it came time to figure out
what to do for dissertation.
I said, I
want to do something on men and
sexuality or sexual violence. He said, no.
Other people are doing
that already. You should. I had written this little autobiographical piece.
My career crash
as a basketball player at Hartnell College, and I had published it in this little men's pro-feminist magazine called
Changing Men
magazine.
And Bob said that.
Short story
that should be
the basis of a research question.
What happens to men? What happens to young men
when their athletic careers end? How does masculinity get reframed? And so that was wonderful suggestion.
That's what I ended up doing.
In-depth interviews. And Bob was a quintessential interviewer. Wrote a really wonderful book called Black Lives, White Lives,
based on life history
interviews with black and white people over a long period of time.
And so I did interviews with men who were former athletes. Some who played through high school, some played through college, some were professionals, and they had to have been out of sports, playing sports for at least 5 years when I interviewed them. I wanted to get at their transition. And that eventually became my first book, Power at Play, and was published a few years after my dissertation came out by Beacon Press.
What did you find in a nutshell? How did they redefine themselves?
Well, I found probably fairly predictably that for many of them there was a pretty traumatic period of time, of sort of loss of identity. A lot of guys who grew up like myself, thinking about stardom and greatness, really hang your identity on it becomes your sort of master status, sociologists would say, and you're losing that at a pretty young age. Men who retire at age 60, 65, we know they go through a lot of identity problems and sometimes health problems. But athletes who are retiring or leaving an identity or failing at an identity, they were so committed to it at age 25, at age 30, at age 35. It's still a very young age, and so there's some self-destructive behaviors at times, risk-taking. Interviewed one guy who was in prison for having done some things that were illegal and dangerous and violent. And health problems. A lot of guys who especially guys who played football, had persistent knee and back, and injury problems. And then also probably predictably, I found some pretty profound race and class differences. The men who were white professional class families, boys. In general, had a pretty easy and smooth transition to something else after they quit playing sports. In fact, some of them were really good high school athletes. Even at high school age. One guy interviewed me said, "I knew this was small potatoes." He was like one of the best athletes in his town. I knew this was small potatoes, and he went to college. And he had athletic scholarship offers, but he didn't even take them. He said, "No, I just wanted to become a dentist." So you can see the operation of class privilege operating there in these life trajectories, and the boys who came from working class, and especially working class boys of color, had all their eggs in that basket. The costs of masculinity, the costs of sort of like failure, especially, and falling short of being able to make a life out of an athletic career. Were much more devastating. So we weren't thinking yet about the term intersectionality wasn't out there quite yet. Intersections of race, class, and gender. But I was already that way, trying to figure out how do we think about masculinity, and not just as this one thing boys and men are sort of pulled into socially, but kind of fractured through our experiences of people of different social classes, racial ethnic groups.
So you TA'd for, was that called a men's studies course at Berkeley?
It was just called Men and Masculinity, I think the class was called. Yeah.
And then did you teach something that had men or masculinity rather than just gender at USC?
Before I came to USC, I taught for 4 years at what was then called Cal State Hayward, but it's Cal State LA, Cal State East Bay. And so my last 2 years of grad school, and then after graduation, finished 2 years after that. And I did. I mean, they had me. I was a full-time adjunct. So they were teaching whatever they wanted me to teach. Intro, social problems. They allowed me to teach one course that I really wanted to teach. So I taught my first men and masculinity course at Hayward. And then I when I was hired at USC. Basically, I was hired because they needed somebody to teach that course. So it was so cool. That was the most important foundational piece that I wanted to work on as a teacher. That's what they wanted me to teach, and then I taught other things as well at USC. But I continue to teach that course once every year. I'll be teaching it next semester. One of the interesting things about that class is when I first started teaching at Cal State Hayward, I could not get any young men.
Right, I was going to ask you.
And it was so frustrating. And I would have maybe 35 or 40 students in that class, and there'd be like 3 or 4 guys, and one or two of them would be men of color. One would be a gay guy. Very out. And then one would be this straight white guy whose girlfriend said, "You better take this class or I'm dumping you." And I would try to recruit them out of my intro class because they wouldn't do it because a lot of guys just felt threatened. It was somehow it was signing up for that class. An admission they didn't know how to do men.
Or that you were gay.
Or that you were gay. So now though. I still have never had a class half men, but it's far more men and a wider sort of range of types of men who take this course and feel very comfortable taking. I think that's one of the nice changes I've seen over time. Is at least with college age young men, there's less of that stigma they fear in taking a course on gender or taking a course that's really focused on men and masculinity.
What topics did you emphasize and were they interested in? And if you looked at your syllabus, the key topics, what were they and will they be next semester? Now, for the last few years, I've used this really neat book by John Ibsen, Picturing Men. And Ibsen is he's just recently retired from Cal State
I want to say Fullerton.
Fullerton.
And he's an American
Studies scholar.
And he
studies
old photographs.
And
he's been a collector of old photographs for many years.
So Picturing Men
is a book that's full of
photographs
that show over time how men
pose
for photographs
when they're posing with other men.
And one of the things
you learn from reading his book is
what I call the
unevenness of social change. How back in the earliest years of
studio
photography,
when you see men
posing together,
our lens that we look through today,
all these guys look like they must be gay
because they're so comfortable
sitting on each other's laps,
hugging each other,
holding hands, arms around each other in really warm ways.
And then in the
1920s and 30s, you see these photographs,
the bodily postures
and then change, and the space between them starts to get created. And then maybe they start using objects to deviate the space. Cigars, bottles, dead animals, to keep from touching each other.
And it's the rise of
homophobia in the early
20th century,
and the rise of Freudianism.
And suddenly men
are now becoming
aware of how other people might view them if they're too if they show too much
affection for each other, physical affection.
So I use that book
as a way to
think about men and intimacy with other
men, and
homophobia,
and how that's changed and affected people over time. So I start with my class with that book, and students tend to really appreciate it. And at the end of reading the book, we spend a couple weeks with it.
I have them bring in
a couple photos
from their own
Instagrams or
from their own lives
of
guys that they know.
Posing together, and sometimes it's them, sometimes it's their brothers or their fathers or
something.
And I make a slideshow, put all their photos up on the screen, and talk about them. So what do you see here? What would John Ibsen say about the way these guys are posing?
And it's
a door that kind of opens up into a lot of topics that I want to deal with in the class.
So I deal with
I definitely deal with violence in the class.
Think about
violence
through the conceptual lens of
Michael Kaufman's
notion of the triad of men's violence.
We need to think about
how violence against women is related to men's violence against other men, and men's violence against ourselves. I always bring in a little bit of sports. I don't focus on it too much, but I still think about and care about a lot. And a lot of students today
in any gender courses, they're really interested in transgender and gender non-binary
people. In fact,
I expect some of the students in my class each semester will find themselves in that way.
So we'll read some works. There's a wonderful sociologist in Canada,
Travers,
who's written about
transgender kids and their families.
And I'll use some of Travers'
work, and
my students usually really resonate with that
work a lot.
So
that's kind of the range of things that I'll look at.
What interests me is in the feminist movement, both men and women, there's a big controversy over are trans men really women? I mean, trans women really women? And I don't understand why. That's another thing I don't understand why it's such a big deal, because there's not that many trans women. I mean, why is it a big political deal?
I think right now,
and especially with
the field of sports, I've always found so interesting
for
so many reasons
in terms of gender,
transgender people have become a real hot potato
Oh,
with sports because it's an institution
that's
that's
organized with
the idea that there are two and only two
Right.
sexes.
and it's
built
men's
that way.
sports,
There's men's sports,
there's
there's boys sports, there's girls sports, there's girls sports,
and so
when you have
showing up
as adults or now increasingly as kids and as youth,
say
I don't want to be put in this box of boy or girl.
I was in this box and now I want to be in this box. Or I don't want to be in either box. Identify as non-binary. It really messes with that whole system that thinking you've got only two sexes and you're going to organize an entire institution around that idea. I think very cynically the far right in this country just in the last year or two has been organizing around
the
that.
bathroom stuff.
When has the far right in our country ever acted as though they care about women's rights? They never have cared about women's rights. But suddenly now, if they're attacked on transgender athletes, they're saying this is a women's issue. This is a women's rights issue. We're out there protecting the women from these men who want to come in and steal the 100-yard dash from them. It's so disgusting and cynical, I think, the way they're doing that. That said, I think institutions like other institutions where we have male and female bathrooms and that sort of thing, we have to change our physical layout of buildings, and we have to question the ways in which organizing institutions like schools and sports. To deal with the radically shifting gender that's many young people take this for granted that there's this gender fluidity in their own lives and they see it, they experience it. So the institutions have to respond to that. As sociologists, it's hard on the ground, but as sociologists, that's part of the fun part of being a sociologist is what's trying to happen and trying to understand it. Right.
What always strikes me about sports is, on one hand, coaches traditionally said, "Don't be pussies, don't be girls, go out there and kill the other guys. Don't be a wuss." And then on the other hand, they're allowed to hug each other and pat each other's rear ends and be real affectionate and lovey-dovey with each other. So it's a very strange message that it gives men about what's okay if you're playing football or something.
Yeah. Those two things do tend to go hand in hand. I think still today, certainly when I grew up, they went up hand in hand. The most masculine of sports involved the disparaging of women and of anything feminine. You or anyone else. Don't throw like a girl. Don't be a wuss. And all this sort of homophobic stuff that gets woven into that. And ironically, that kind of homophobic misogyny creates an opening for men within that little box to engage in certain types of intimacy with each other that might otherwise be questioned. And I think that's part of the power of those masculine sports teams. Is that part of the sort of emotional power of it is that guys look back on those experiences sometimes as they do with the military experience. Those are the closest relationships I ever had. I haven't seen that guy for 20 years, but I know lay himself down for me if I needed him. That sort of thing. And it's very real and very deep. But it speaks to the emotional paucity of many of our other relationships that we have with each other. The limits, intimacy, I think that experience in most other contexts that it becomes the meaningful.
Right. What's your understanding of the spread of men's studies classes? I know there's some in Australia, there's some in Canada. Obviously in the U.S., there's a American Men's Studies Association, there's journals. What else is going on? And second part of that question is, a lot of women's studies programs change to gender, sexuality, but do they really include men's studies and gender studies?
Well, you mentioned several parts of the world, and I would also add many parts of Europe
some
and
other countries as well, where you see courses taught
and research being
The
done
UK,
on
Scandinavia,
the Scandinavian countries, Iceland,
South Africa,
a certain
probably urban parts of India,
all over the place.
There are scholars now who study and teach about
masculinity
and boys. The terminology has changed over time. I mean, there were a lot of
the older women
that I started off with, in gender studies at USC and other places,
were really committed
because they fought so hard to get women's studies, curriculum, programs, and so forth built into the university, and keeping that word women centrally was very important to them, partly as a historical marker of why we studied this in the first place. It wasn't men who said, "Gee, gender should be studied, because it's problematic." Women, just like it wasn't white people who said you need to study race. Like the people who are in the subordinate groups tend to be the ones who notice social inequality along these lines, and in academia are the ones who say we should be studying this and taking it seriously. So when things started to kind of expand in different ways, queer studies comes in the 80s and 90s and starts questioning these categories, and intersectionality, race, class, gender comes in the 80s and 90s, starts to question this whole concept of women as this unified whole. And then I think just kind of pragmatically programs are also trying to angle themselves within their institutions to get legitimacy and get money and get funding. My program was called Program to Study of Women in Society. From the get-go, before I even got to USC, it was called that. And I think some people say, well, this was really forward-looking by the people who shaped this program, because no other programs were calling themselves women and men. Women's studies. And maybe it was forward-looking in some ways, but it was also strategic in a relatively conservative university at the time. How do you get women's studies? And you say, well, we're going to also study the men. So, don't feel too strong. And there might have been that a little bit as well. But then, after a few years, people started talking about, let's change it to gender studies. And we had a dean who was very in favor of that idea too. That's the subject matter, isn't it? But there was a lot of resistance against that. So I know a lot of places around changed their names to women and gender studies programs to try to keep that term women centrally in the name. And our program eventually did change to gender studies, and then when we became a department, we changed it to gender and sexuality studies. So then the terminology kind of shifts and morphs over time, I think, to reflect what's going on the ground in one way. But you asked, I think, also just about men's studies and place in all of that. Because I've never. I was actually hired to do the men's studies search. So I technically was hired into a men's studies position, but I never felt entirely comfortable with that term. Or thinking of the work that I did as quote men's studies. I think a bit more. I study boys and men empirically, but I also study gender relations with women. I study women as well. Some of my research is focused more on women than on some of the recent stuff with military veterans, for instance. But I think of the kind of institutional and intellectual space of what some people call men's studies as being part of a broader gender studies interdisciplinary gender studies field. And
To me that's
important because
I think it's there's a certain danger in cordoning off, saying institutionally we're going to study men and masculinity. I started noticing this back in maybe around the year 1995, 2000 or something like that, where I would have students who would say, I would like to do a graduate student, I want to do a directed reading on masculinity. And usually when I do a directed reading, someone would say, well, give me your preliminary list, and then I'll add to it, see what's missing. And back in the 80s, early 90s, I would get a list like that from somebody, and it would always include foundational works by feminist women. And then I started to see in the 90s, 2000s, the preliminary list I would get from students would be all works by men, about men. To me, there was no foundation. It was like a taken for granted, just ignored foundation. Where does the study of men and masculinity come from? It comes from the foundation that was laid by scholars who were critically studying social inequality and the cost to women, men's violence, and all these kind of things. So I think the fear that I've had there's enough scholarship, enough really good work, that people can come in and study men and masculinity without really looking at or acknowledging where it comes from. And there's a real danger in that, because then it can spin off into I think false equivalencies. Like, they study women, I study men. There's something hierarchical in the gender relation there that we need to hold centrally. Stay focused.
But is your sense, from what you know, that gender studies programs do in fact include men's studies? I mean, would they have like a book about men or a course about men, or what's your sense of how men's studies is included in gender studies?
I think a lot of places have at least a course where they'll have somebody on their faculty who studies boys or studies men or studies men's violence or something like that. Frankly, I think the direction a lot of gender studies courses are going now. The direction I'm a part of are going is not really emphasizing the need to hire a new women's historian. We have a great women's historian in our program, Lois Banner, who retired a few years ago. No, they're not really. History department's not really interested in replacing her with another women's historian. I think the directions that we're going, and I don't know what they're going to do to replace me when I retire, but the direction that our program is going, a lot of gender studies programs are going is towards more kind of queer, trans, gender fluidity, research, and of course these are interdisciplinary programs. Humanities have always kind of drifted in that direction anyway. Social scientists, especially if they're more quantitative, we're interested still in categories and trying to think about distribution of income, things like that. To do that, you have to think in terms of categories. I think there's a very anti-categorical tendency built into a lot of interdisciplinary gender studies now. I don't think. I have mixed feelings about it, frankly. I do think of myself as someone who's interested in distributive justice, and which really is a simple way of putting how material resources are divided unequally in the world. In order to understand that, you have to understand categories. You have to be able to at least provisionally accept categories. There are people in the world called black people, and when we measure them against other people, we can see that they get a lot less money, they get put in prison in greater numbers, rates of violence against them. And there are people in the world called women, and we can see that gender-based violence, men victims of gender-based violence, too, but the rates that victimhood, survivorship of women are much higher. But I do think that there are courses on men and masculinity. They're either connected with interdisciplinary programs, or they're connected with departments like psychology departments, sociology departments, and so forth. There are a lot of them out there.
It's really hard to find. I've been looking for lists of colleges, universities with men's studies programs, and the American Men's Studies Association doesn't have one. The only one I could find is Michael Flood has a XY with a lot of bibliographical information. He lists 17 men's studies course outlines. So do you know of some place that lists men's studies courses? Like there's women's studies courses. Joan Corman puts it together and she lists boom, boom, boom. Here's these 900 courses or whatever, programs, whatever it is.
I'm not really sure. I know there was a guy many years ago, Sam Femiano, who used to have a collection, a bibliography and a collection of courses that he would keep up on. But it's been many years since I.
So that seems strange to me that the American Men's Studies Association doesn't have a list of courses.
Yeah, that surprises me. too. I didn't know that.
Does the Men's Studies Association do conferences? Because sometimes it's helpful, to meet face to face and talk in the hallways after some kind of workshop. Oh, you're doing this? Is there anything like that?
What they do.
AMSA does
annual meetings. I think probably like a lot of people. They've been remotely the last couple of years, but I know they still meet. I haven't been. I went to one of their conferences 10 years ago. I'm just not a big conference person, frankly. But I know they still do. And then you have professional associations, like the psychologists. Is it Section 51 or whatever they call
division.
it? And Division 51.
And then in sociology we have a section, gender section of sociology, but there's a pretty good group of people within that who work on men and masculinity. Tristan Bridges, who I mentioned to you, Santa Barbara. Others, Kristen Barber, former student of mine, Illinois. There's a lot of people who are courses on men and masculinity. But I'm not sure if there's somebody who has kept a list of them.
Well, we'll have to look into that some more. In terms of your students that you've seen over the years, people used to be talking about Gen Y as fragile teacups, their parents, helicopter parents, zooming in to try to, why did you give my kid a C? And now what I'm hearing about young people is anxiety, depression. So I wonder what you're seeing in terms of trends in your young students.
The students that I have
at USC, and I've been there over 30 years now, just academically stronger over time. They're undergraduates. They're excellent. They're wonderful, excellent, committed students. And they I think part of the academic preparation and excellence comes with experiences that they've had since they were very young, having a lot of pressure on themselves to be straight A students, be the number one in the class, and I don't find them to be overly competitive, really negative, at least overtly sort of way. But I think that they internalize a lot of pressure to perform. There's a performance anxiety that some of them have, and I don't see this manifest too much in the classroom. But I know people I've talked to who work in the counseling center, worked there for many years, and they say that that's the main thing that they see now. I mean, of course, they're still seeing a lot of other things. Depression, they see sexual assault, issues, and so forth. But the anxiety. Is something that they are seeing more and more over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. People
but
like,
I don't like the kind of snowflake or those sort of projections onto young people our age. They're dealing with different issues than we dealt with. They have social media and the internet, which we can't even imagine what life would have been like when we were their age. There's positives and negatives to it, of course. But I find them to be, a generation of people. You don't want to overly generalize, but at least the people I deal with who find their way to my classes. They're really open-minded. They want to kind of be good people, and they want to engage in the world in productive ways. I think I don't meet a lot of students who are ideologically frozen into a position. I think probably I was by the time I was a senior in college. I had my Marxist position at that time. I was pretty frozen into it for a while. But I think there's an intellectual openness that I find really exciting with a lot of my students. And the last every other year for the last 5 years, I've taught a freshman seminar. That's so fun. They're so sweet, so smart, and so ready to engage. And they have a lot of skills from their high school experience already. So I really like them. A lot. I'm going to retire in a couple of years. I think I'll miss that. Miss that kind of engagement with young people.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that young men are 40% of the college students and not 50%, and young women are more likely to graduate and go on to grad school? That seems to me a huge switch.
And I think some of those numbers that I've seen over the last few years. I think they're probably correct, but I think oftentimes they don't really look at things along lines of race and class very much. I think that young guys from professional class, white backgrounds are still doing just fine in terms of academic access and their trajectories through school and into the workforce. And I think that the really interesting and troublesome difference gender-wise is in poor and working class and of color communities. Boys, young black and Latino boys, working class backgrounds. They're having a really hard time with their public lives, including schools. And I think the institutions have not. Our positive institutions like schools have figured out how to serve them, and our negative institutions like the penal institution, the courts are hammering. And so I think that's a lot of the story. I have a recent graduate student, Michael Musto, who's went on to a really productive postdoc at Stanford. Now has a job at University of British Columbia. Her dissertation was on a 3-year long ethnographic study of a very diverse middle school. And I always tell my students, don't do a 3-year long study. It's too long for your dissertation. But she was very ambitious, and she's having an article in the American Sociological Review, and she's working on a book right now. But one of the things that she shows is kids coming in as 6th graders, 7th and 8th grade, looking at boys and girls, also boys and girls, social class and racial ethnic groups. She shows how by the time that you go from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, the white professional class boys' trajectory through that process ends up the sort of social definition of a lot of those boys by the time they get into 8th grade is everyone looks at them as geniuses, and they are. I even told her at one point, you should talk about this. How to become a genius. Because she looks at the sort of disciplinary practices of the teachers of the schools, and when those boys transgress or do things wrong as sixth graders, seventh graders.
It's like, oh, boys will be boys. They're young, they're immature, they're funny,
and then the other boys, the brown boys, boys from working class backgrounds, when they transgress, the hammer comes down on them. By the time you get to eighth grade, she describes those boys as sitting in the back of the room with their heads on their desks. And we interviewed them in sixth grade. They were perky and hopeful. By eighth grade, she interviews them, and they say, nobody cares about me. They've given up on me. I'm gonna screw it. I'm gonna go out and have a good time. So there's this way in which you can see how social processes in that 6th, 7th, 8th grade period kind of set up these pipelines that we think about when we look at college. We see a lot more girls of color that are making it into college pretty well in college. We see a lot of boys and girls from privileged class and race backgrounds getting into college pretty well as well. So there's this sorting process that happens through informal mechanisms, and some of it has to do with their grade school experiences and their family experiences as well. It's not just what teachers are doing or administrators are doing, but I think there are these sort of sorting processes that happen in schools that help explain the race, class, gender differences that we're seeing at the college level.
The men of color that I interviewed for this book who work with boys said that for brown boys, it's not cool to be smart. It's like, hey, you acting white. Who you think you are. So it's not just not encouraged, it's discouraged.
Yeah, and I found some of that in my first study I ever did. Former athletes, some of the black men talked about. I remember one guy who ended up being an NFL football player, very well known NFL football player for 10 years. But as a kid, he was into reading and he was into playing piano. And he said that he had to hide that from his peers. Guys in his neighborhood give him a hard time about it. So imagine what strength and fortitude it would take to have to persist with that and to attempt to continue to have your athletic strivings, but also to hold on to those interests.
I wanted to ask you, what are the political correctness terms for men's studies? There's masculinity studies, men's studies, hegemonic masculinity, hybrid masculinity, and there's like overtones that I don't understand to those terms.
I think a term that I've heard that also to add to all those ones that you mentioned is critical masculinity studies. Is one that a lot of people have adopted and use. I don't latch on to any of them, frankly. I like to think of myself as doing research on boys and men, and I take a critical and feminist orientation toward that research, and I teach about it. And I haven't really found it very useful to think about the overarching term. A couple of those things you mentioned, hybrid masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, those are concepts I think that are useful in the field. I don't think they're used necessarily to define programs or organizations.
What do they mean? What does critical masculinity studies imply?
It implies that if you use it for masculinities as plural, which I think they usually do, masculinity, that implies there isn't one form of masculinity, that there are various forms of masculinities that are historically, culturally differently, graphically perhaps, by social class, race, sexual, there's all kinds of ways in which masculinity are shaped. And critical usually just means that you're asking questions about power. You're asking critical questions about organization, operation of power, and inequality, and how masculinity in various forms kind of mesh with understanding of inequality and power.
She lost her her toy. Here, eat your bone. Go get your bone. Sorry.
It's okay.
And what's hybrid masculinity mean?
Well, two younger sociologists, younger by my standards, Chris and C.J. Pascoe, developed this concept a few years back, and it's really taken off, especially with sociologists who study gender. And what they're proposing, and I think it makes a whole lot of sense, is that when we think about new formations, masculinity, like, guys who are more emotionally expressive or something like that. Reacting to it, those guys weren't supposed to be emotionally expressive. Sometimes we can look at that as just kind of this progression. It's like That's wonderful thing. That are becoming emotionally expressive. In some ways, yes. I want to believe that as well. But the idea of hybrid masculinity is that when you look at this collectively, it's not just in terms of one person, that if guys are becoming more emotionally expressive with each other or something like that, it might be that they're kind of grafting on. It might be men who are retaining a certain amount of masculine privilege, but they're kind of grafting on a style of masculinity from subordinate groups of men, and then kind of patting themselves on the back and saying, we're emotionally expressive. While at the same time, if you look at their positions in society, that emotional expressiveness might actually be serving to solidify a certain privilege. So it's a way of taking sort of critique of power and inequality, looking at shifts and changes among men in the culture, and asking the question, like, what does this mean? What are there ways in which men are white men are sort of adopting styles of some black men? Right, and then does that really mean that we're less racist? Or does it mean that we're kind of just appropriating styles of black people that make us feel more cool and therefore raise our status? So hybrid masculinity, and same with gay, like a lot of things that were started out as gay styles that were disparaged. Through the culture industry, get sold back to heterosexual new ways to be men, So hybrid masculinity helps us ask those questions about piecing together styles of masculinity, mostly by privileged men, and asking critical questions about what does that mean? Do we just sort of applaud this because it's new and different, or do we take a critical view and ask, is this helping to reconfigure power and equality in society, or just shore it up?
And hegemonic masculinity implies patriarchy, right?
Well, that's a term that was introduced by Ray many years ago, and has really been taken up and is probably misunderstood in a lot of ways. And James Messner, the sociologist, has helped to sharpen our understanding of that. I think of it as just a way to think about the situational and at least momentarily in this moment in history, things that men do that help to shore up men's power and privilege. So hegemonic masculinity would be Connell uses the term of configuration of practices, which I'm not sure really makes a lot of people, but it's a collection of things that men do that help to solidify and shore up men's power and privilege. And it's kind of taking the term hegemonic or from hegemony from Gramsci, who was really talking about class relations and the ways that social class is shored up, class privilege is shored up in society. Gramsci said, not so effective to shore up class privilege with the fist, just like pounding down the working class. It's much better to develop hegemony or the sort of continuation or solidification of power over the working class pulling the working class in and convincing them that this is a really good system for them. They're going to get something. They're going to get something. Maybe they can strive for people being upper class. If you develop consent among the rules, it's much more effective to retain your power than it is to just beat them down.
Mark said the same thing. In terms of, I have to pick up my grandson and I have to leave in 3 minutes. In terms
I'm grouping my voice.
In terms of the men's movement today, would you agree that the Mankind Project and those kind of self-help support groups, peer-led groups, are the biggest branch of the men's movement?
I'm not really sure if I see there being a men's movement. I think there are a lot of things going on in the country and in the world around men and masculinity. There's huge efforts in anti-violence. There's huge efforts in Africa and India around men and health and HIV and parenting. That some of them are being fueled by NGO work. I think it's good in a lot of ways. There's a white ribbon campaign internationally and other organizations that are trying to employ boys and men to end gender-based violence. And I've done some research on those organizations and men in those organizations. There's this fathering organizations. There's a lot of organizing and there's probably more than enough talk, but there's also a lot of organizing around boys and men in the world, and in our country, I think. And whether there is a men's movement, I think of movements as organized efforts to change social structures. And I guess there are organizations of men and women who are trying to change gender structures in the world. But they're not all pushing in the same directions. Sometimes they're pushing against each other. So to me again, that idea of the unevenness of social change, I think, is one that I continue to latch on to. It asks each of us think about where we want to plant our feet and which people we want to work with, which people we want to commit ourselves to changing the world with what direction we want to push things.
Thank you.